All
Perfect.
right. Can you guys see that?
All right. I will set the recording. And now, thank you everyone for coming. Whatever students that decided to show up today, thank you. And for everyone else, thank you. Thank you very much as well. I'll give the floor to Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy. And hopefully, this will be a good time.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm told you guys need to learn arguments for God's existence, so I'm going to present three arguments for God's existence. Now, this is not going to be the William Lane Craig version. These are not going to be the Richard Swinburne versions. This is going to be using a lot of cutting edge science, a lot of cutting edge philosophy, which I just said doesn't exist before prior. So, but as a joke. But anyway, let's dive right in here. I presented points from these arguments to one of my philosophy professors when I was getting my master's. And I didn't tell him I was really arguing for God's existence. I was trying to make a case for idealism. And he was like, and as I'm like trying to build this case for idealism, he's like, well, wait a minute, this just sounds like theism. I'm like, exactly. So that's kind of, and the funny thing is like a lot of this stuff I think just necessarily leads to theism, probabilistically leads to theism. I think that's what the data just shows. So it's not that we are just doing the old thing of God of the gaps. Oh, I can't explain this in nature, therefore God did it. I think the data we have now leads to God. So let's go through some of these points here to start. So first, what do we mean by God? Simply put, a necessary and immaterial mind that created the universe whose nature is ideal or absolute perfection. Now, I'll come back to explain this a little bit more later on. So if you have any questions, just know we're going to come back to this. So here's the first argument for God's existence. Sounds pretty simple, okay? If the universe is emergent, it is emergent from a mind. Premise two, the universe is emergent. Conclusion, therefore, the universe is emergent from a mind. So I'm going to start by defending the second premise, and then I'll move to the first premise. So what I mean that the universe is emergent. So the common belief you're going to get around your university today is that the universe is composed of particles. There are trillions upon trillions upon trillions of these particles that make up the universe. But that's not really what the science shows today. So Walter Schmidt says particles are actually waves in different types of field. This goes for all the particles that we are made of. We are all just made of waves in a field. What looks to us as a billiard ball on a billiard table is actually a bunch of waves moving from the cue to the pocket. So you're not actually made of these little tiny balls that people tend to think of. Okay. Well, they're just these blips and fields. Maybe we are just fields. Like there's these underlying substance of all of reality is fields. Well, the philosopher and physicist David John Baker said that doesn't work. The same issues we have for particles apply to fields. In other words, we cannot get them to be actual little substances. And when he put this paper out a while back, people were like, okay, yeah, that's a pretty strong argument. And he basically has convinced a lot of people in the field. So, generally, point many of the problems, particle interpretations also apply to field interpretations. We can't, in a nutshell, what David John Baker is saying is that if you want to think of a particle like a little ball, well, you can't. It's just information of a field. But that same issue applies to fields. It's all just mathematical information. It's not like a substance. Okay? It's not like something you could pick up if it was big enough. It's not like that. So this is the problem we have. Now, philosopher Minor Kuhlman notes that when it comes to physics, it lacks a coherent account of fundamental issues, such as the definition of objects. And it is not at all clear what a particle or field even is. Quantum field theory, which is like the base of all reality, okay, doesn't really tell us what substance quantum fields are. Instead, we only get an understanding of structures, relations, activities, and properties. In other words, when we look at the underlying quantum world, when the physicists are doing their work, they're not talking about substances or little balls bouncing around. They're talking about structures, relations, activities, properties, without reference to any substance. It's kind of weird. He says it's like having a marriage without spouses. You're talking about the marriage contract and what you're supposed to do, but there's no two spouses there. That doesn't make any sense. He also says quantum field theory works without any relation to a fundamental substance that gives rise to field or particles. So we have all these mathematical equations down there that we're using to explain reality, but there is no particles. There's no substances. Very weird. So it's almost like a good analogy I like to give is almost like being in a video game. You know, if you've ever played a video game, you walk into a room in your avatar, and there's maybe a cup on the table. When you leave, the cup is not still there in a space. It's just a bunch of ones and zeros, isn't it? It's just information. It's kind of like how our reality is at the fundamental level. Everything is just information. We may pick up a cup and think it's a physical object, but it's just a collection of information there. This is what physics is now telling us. If the particles are made of information or just information, the objects that particles are built out of are also just information. So very, very crazy stuff here. James Glatfelder says the very notion of materialism now appears misguided. Our worldview has been shattered. Okay? Jan Westerhoff says the moral to draw from the reductionist scenario seems to be that either what is fundamental is not material, or that nothing at all is fundamental. Now that's kind of mind-blowing if you think about it. When we're looking at the physical universe, we're not finding anything fundamental at the base. Everything just seems to be a bunch of analogous to ones and zeros. Now that's kind of wild. So, any questions about the second premise before I move to the first premise? If not, I'm just going to keep going. So, and I can't see the chat if there's a chat here. So, because I'm on full screen. So, if no one's going to pipe in, I'm just going to move on. Great. All right. Going once, going twice. Let's go. Okay. So the first premise is if the universe is emergent, it's emergent from a mind. So how do we get there? Well, let me lay out 4 arguments in favor of the first premise. The first is just from simplicity. Okay, so think about we have to pause it on like materialism or physicalism. You have us here at the top. We are conscious agents, which are built by particles, which are built by fields, which are built from some underlying unknown substance. Okay, this is complicated. But let's have an idealist ontology, which is that mind creates reality. And what it would be is that minds basically give rise to the particles and fields. Okay? That's far simpler because we know minds exist. We know, obviously, your consciousness, you know you're a mind and you know that you exist. So we know they exist. So if we know they exist, that is it. We're explaining reality with things we already know exist versus the opposite of some mysterious underlying substance beyond detection that we could never know about to explain reality. So it's just simpler to say that maybe a mind, the universe is emergent from a mind created the universe. It's just simpler. And just remember what, for example, various philosophers have pointed out. Multiple lines of argument support the conclusion that quantum field theory does not describe a world that contains particles as fundamental entities. These arguments rely on special relativistic or general relativistic premises. I've added the proposal that particles be considered fictions in another sense. Particles and quasi-particles in condensed matter physics supply physical intuitions that are useful for formulating mathematical framework for quantum field theory, but which do not represent the world even approximately. So this is not coming from your local pot dealer. This is not coming from some crazy guy on YouTube. This is coming from the Routledge Companion to Philosophy of Physics. Okay? Particles should be considered fictions. It's wild stuff, but this is what the science and the philosophy is showing. Now, I've been talking a little bit about idealism. What is idealism? Idealism is just that mind and consciousness, not matter, is the ground of all being. So on physicalism, you have something physical substance is the ground of all being. And then consciousness emerges from physical processes. You have someone like William Lane Craig or Richard Swinburne that would be a substance dualist. They say, well, there's actually 2 substances. There's mind and matter, and they interact somehow. The idealist is on the other side. That's me. We just say all is mind, and physical emerges from that. Any questions about that at all? Great. If you have any questions, just, I don't know, Michael Wang, how you want to handle questions. If someone just wants to unmute themselves or they want to put something in the chat and you just read it to me, I don't know. But if I don't hear any questions, I'm just going to move on.
Yeah, I think people can just raise their hand Um,
Okay.
I think I think one question that may be helpful to other people is that maybe people here aren't familiar with philosophy of mind terminology. What is emergence? Because there's a lot of literature around emergent properties and things like that.
Yeah, so I mean, like emergent just would mean. Let me think of the best way to define it. So let me give some examples. So people would say consciousness emerges from the brain. So basically, there's something that exists, and then it gives rise to something else. So emergent would mean that something else gave rise to you or to something. So, for example, we would say that wetness is a emergent property from water particles. Wetness is not something that exists on its own. It only exists when there's enough H2O in one place. And you could say the emergent property of wetness, if that helps explain what that means. So, on idealism, we say the physical emerges from mind. Now, I'll come back to this more later on, just giving you a rough idea of what it means here. So here's a good way to explain kind of where the idealist gets this crazy idea from. Okay, so this is Keith Ward. He's a philosopher. He's an idealist. Think of it like this. This is what he wants you to think about. He says any physicist will say that brains are mostly empty space in which molecules, atoms, electrons, quarks, and other strange particles buzz about in complicated ways. It seems as though physical objects, when not being observed, have no colors and no sounds, smells, or tastes either. Sounds, like colors, are not physical events. Neither are smells, tastes, or sensations. Things do not smell like, taste like, or feel like anything when nobody's smelling, tasting, or feeling them. The physical world, it seems, is totally vacuous. So what is he trying to get at here? Okay, think about it on an idealist perspective here, okay? What do you experience? You experience colors, you experience smells, tastes, sensations, but those aren't really physical things. Those are mental sensations. What is a color? Science says there's a wavelength that hits the eye, makes a chemical reaction, which then creates electrical signals in the brain. Okay, none of that is color, though, but that's what you experience. So the entire world of what we experience is a mental imagery. It's mental qualia. Everything you experience is mental. Think of the analogy of the video game again. When you go into a video game, you experience colors, but when you turn the video game off, there's just code there. So there's a gap, a fundamental gap between what we experience and what we think the physical world is. So the idealist is just saying, well, the physical world, everything we experience just reduces to these mental sensations. The colors you see, the shapes you see, the experiences you have. None of those would exist if there weren't people there to observe it with the brains and the eyes and everything that we have here. So, given all this, it's far simpler to want to go back to this part here. Some sort of mysterious physical substance gives rise to quantum fields, which gives rise to particles, which gives rise to consciousness, which then gives rise to the experiences we have. It's far simpler to say that mind is fundamental and the physical is this emergent world from mind. And it is the collection of the colors, the tastes, the sensations, the imagery we all see. If that's the case, the universe would have to emerge from a mind. That's a simpler argument there. So, second argument to support the first premise of the argument. So we talked about what is God. God is an immaterial mind that created the universe and has one property. That property is called absolute perfection. Absolute perfection basically entails all great making properties. So omnipotence, omniscience, necessity, moral perfection. If you're an absolutely perfect being, you would have all these great making properties. Now that's a very simple explanation. One God, one mind, and it has absolute perfection. That created the universe. That is far simpler than positing some imperfect, non-sentient substance at the base of all reality that give rise to all of its complexity without being perfect. Now we have to come up with all sorts of brute facts as to why the universe is the way it is, or why the universe gave rise to this or that. We're adding complexity here. It's far simpler just to posit one mind with one property. That's far less bruteness. Meanwhile, a naturalist has a more brutal explanation. There's my one pun for the day. So the philosopher T. Ryan Byerly notes that there is nothing in proposed non-theistic foundational entities that explains why they would be necessary. So we could say, well, why does God exist? Well, God's necessary. So that's why he exists, and that's why we can posit a God that gave rise to the universe. Okay. Well, what does the atheist or the naturalist want to do? They want to posit something that's not God, something non-sentient, as the base of all reality that gave rise to it. Why would it be necessary? It doesn't entail absolute perfection. So now you have to come up with an additional explanation for why this non-theistic entity is necessary. You're adding explanations, you're adding assumptions, or you're adding brute facts, however you want to word it. Theism eliminates this and reduces the number of brute facts we posit because the definition of God entails necessary existence. Ideal perfection has an internal nature that can explain its own necessity. So God is self-contained. God's nature can explain it's himself or itself, however you want to word that. Brian Leftow says this. He says, so far then, it seems that perfect being theism can explain more of the natural than naturalism can, with equal explanatory power, and leave less brute at the fundamental level in doing so. Theism's extra ontology buys a lot. So again, it's much simpler to posit one explanation of reality. That explanation has the property of absolute perfection, which makes it a being, entails moral perfection, omnipotence, omniscience. So the naturalist wants to say, well, we don't want to posit that, but they can't explain how a non-sentient could be perfect without entailing those properties. It doesn't follow. So any questions about this argument here? Great. Hope you're all tracking. Another argument I want to present to argue, I'm presenting arguments here to support, I'll just put it back on the screen, this first premise. The universe is emergent, it's emergent from a mind. This is another argument I like to use. It's kind of interesting. So there's a whole field out there called quantum cognition, which essentially can be summed up in one sentence. What they're basically saying is that your mental processes can be modeled using the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics. That's generally what they're saying. The way our mind works, the way we think, the way we operate appears to be quantum. So think of an analogy. So have you ever had a difficult decision to make? You're thinking about I don't know, you're in college, so you don't have difficult decisions yet. When do you get a mortgage? So you ever been trying to think about what you want to have for lunch? Do I want to go get Chinese? Do I want to go get a hoagie? Do you guys say hoagies in California? I'm from Pittsburgh. That's what we say. But do you guys get hoagie? Do I want to get a sandwich? And then you make a decision and you say, I'm going to get a sandwich. Okay. Well, that kind of sounds similar to something we call superposition in quantum mechanics. There's all these different possibilities, and then an observer interacts with the system and it collapses, called quantum collapse, collapses to one definite position. So what researchers are saying, well, that kind of sounds like how we think, doesn't it? You can have entanglement. We know in quantum mechanics, you can have two particles on the opposite side of the universe, and if they're entangled, change the one affects the other. But sometimes it appears our thoughts are entangled. You ever hear a song and it reminds you of some memory from your childhood? It's like they're kind of entangled. So what they say is, if you just start modeling the way we think, our processes in terms of quantum mechanics, kind of similar. The mind acts and behaves quantum-like. So this is what psychologists have been doing. They've been applying the field of quantum modeling to our own cognitive processes, and they've been coming up with marvelous results. But not just that. Just as a side note, new research within the past few years has actually been kind of suggesting that maybe there actually are quantum processes in the brain. They're being shielded in these tiny little areas called microtubules, where the quantum processes can be protected from interaction and decoherence. Just interesting stuff. Now, here's the argument. I explained to you quantum cognition. Let's think of the argument here. Okay, so think of it like this. Our inner world of thoughts, quality, emotion can be modeled in terms of quantum processes. Okay? Your mind, can be modeled in terms of quantum processes. But we know quantum processes gave rise to space, time, and matter. Everything is just quantum interactions at the base level. That's not even debated. So if space, time, and matter are emergent from underlying quantum processes, and the inner world of consciousness and mind can be modeled via quantum processes, what does that suggest? The simplest explanation is that those underlying quantum processes represent a mind, some sort of fundamental, necessary mind that gave rise to the universe. Because again, the mind can be modeled in terms of quantum processes. We know the universe emerges from quantum processes. Okay? Therefore, the universe likely emerges from a mind or something that would be indiscernible from a mind. It acts and behaves like a mind, but it wouldn't be a mind. Very unlikely. Very unlikely. Again, if the mind is quantum or behaves quantum, and the universe emerges from something that's quantum, that suggests that what at the base level of reality is a mind or something very, 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 very much like it. So any questions about that? Real quick, let me just say that I actually reached out to a quantum cognition researcher about this several years ago. And he says, yeah, it could be a coincidence, but it seems like they're sharing some sort of conceptual nature, our minds and the underlying base of reality. It seems as though that would be the logical conclusion. So he seemed to like the argument I was presenting. Any questions about this argument here?
I think it's really interesting. Is my mic working?
Yep.
Oh, cool. I think it's really interesting that a lot of naturalistic explanations have a hard time like explaining consciousness itself. Like how do we actually experience things, Because I feel like our minds are completely immaterial. I mean, sure
Yeah.
we utilize our brains to process things, but the actual act of consciousness and experience itself, that I don't think can be explained by natural processes.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. When I get to my second argument, I'm going to make an argument from consciousness for God's
Ooh,
existence.
I am very excited because I think C.S. Lewis makes a very good argument on that, but it's been a while since I've read any of his things.
This is a good area of to define some terms.
Okay.
Because
That
I think
too.
a lot of people I think who are in this space kind of know what these terms mean, but I think naturalism. Could you help define naturalism? Because I believe nature in and of itself is a very ambiguous term. I know Oppie does a lot of work in his naturalistic philosophy, but could you help define for the students what naturalism is? What's the distinction between mind and brain? Because just
Mhm.
a lot of people use those terms interchangeably as well. So could you please enlighten us about how those are used in philosophy of mind?
Yeah, so naturalism is just understood to be that the only that what reality is just what the natural world is. It would be only consist of the physical laws, physical things. There's nothing beyond the natural. And if there was, it would also be natural in some way. So if we discovered a multiverse, it would be natural. If we discovered something beyond that, it would be natural. That's just what they say. It's kind of arbitrary in how naturalism is defined because what do you mean by natural? This is debated among philosophers because it's not like it's that cut and clear. Like you can think of quantum entanglement. Okay, we know nothing in the universe can move faster than the speed of light. But if you have two particles separated on opposite sides of the universe, if you change the one, will instantly affect the other. How does that happen if it can't move faster than the speed of light? It should take billions of years to get there, the signal, to change the other. So entanglement appears to be happening outside of the natural universe. It's violating the speed of light somehow. Now, some philosophers will be like, well, that's just another natural process. Fair enough. But I mean, like, what do you mean by natural? So it generally just becomes kind of arbitrary and where the limits of naturalism are defined. And this is a whole debate. Alvin Planting has written on this if you're interested. But I
Someone's
think Luca's got a
Yeah,
question.
someone's raising their hand. You can unmute and speak.
I think you muted yourself,
Oh
Luca.
yeah,
I don't
Luca,
know.
you've muted yourself.
Luca, are you there? I don't know what's going on.
Okay, we can continue. If Luca raises his hand again, we can.
Oh wait, there's a comment here. You previously said that a lot of naturalistic explanations require a lot of brute facts to work and thus are less simple. Couldn't we reject them by the PSR since they require facts without explanations to work? Yeah, you can. Now, philosophers like Graham Oppy will come up with explanation. Sorry. The PSR is the principle of sufficient reason. So basically, everything has a reason in a nutshell. So that's just generally what it means. It's pretty self-explanatory. Yeah, so Oppy will come up with all sorts of different explanations as to why, as to account for these things. He won't just, say, yeah, I don't know. Philosophers like Richard Swinburne will push back and go, well, some of these explanations you're coming up with are just brute facts, and you're multiplying the amount of brute facts beyond necessity. We're going to reject it. So you could, but here's the thing. I don't think you can. I don't know if I've ever heard that argument. I think Oppy is very good at coming up with reasons. The pushback for someone like Oppy is to say that he's just getting ad hoc. His explanation is becoming more ad hoc. He's multiplying bruteness, even though he can come up with reasons. Because sometimes you could just say the reason is a brute fact. So that would be sufficient there. But you're just multiplying bruteness. So I hope that answers your explanation. So another question is, so like God being the uncaused causer. Yeah, that's exactly what we're arguing. And the naturalist or the physicalist would say the uncaused causer is something non-sentient at the base level. Matthew asks, does your argument presuppose a particle interpretation of quantum mechanics, or does it go through regardless of which interpretation one might be wedded to? That depends. Some yes, some no. Like if you're going to take a Bohmian interpretation, no. Because they're going to reject quantum field theory in favor of a Bohmian interpretation. But yeah, for a lot of them, yes, it would work. Like I'm trying to think. Like, so for example, the standard interpretation, I think it would probably work for the many worlds even. But that's a whole other subject, because those are interpretations of quantum mechanics. I'm talking about quantum field theory, which is the combination of quantum mechanics and special relativity. So this is why a lot of physicists are hesitant to move to other interpretations of quantum mechanics, because we already got quantum field theory. We don't want to try to redevelop that with Bohmian mechanics, for example. So I hope that helps. Brandon asks, if God is the most natural thing in existence, wouldn't you reject the natural-supernatural distinction? I absolutely do reject the natural-supernatural distinction. I think it's arbitrary. What is natural? Where are the limits? Are the laws of logic natural or supernatural? How about quantum processes? I mean, it's all arbitrary. I think that's a whole other topic about just the incoherency of naturalism. So I hope that helps. All right, let me get back to the presentation now. So let me give it one more argument in favor of this to support the idea the universe is emergent from a mind. So a couple years ago, there was an astrophysicist and a neurosurgeon, and they decided that they were going to get together, and they noted something odd. The way the cosmic web of galaxies operates is very similar to how our brains operate, which was kind of confusing to them. And they noted various aspects seem to align, like total neuron to observable galaxies, power spectrum analysis, even information processing. Now, on idealism, this would make sense. Brains are the images or representations of conscious minds. So the way you got to think about it is that it's not that there's a brain and a mind of these two substances. Your brain is what consciousness looks like in a physical world. Now, if conscious agent is going to enter reality, it's got to look like something. It looks like you. So you are the representation of what consciousness looks like. By and large, if the universe emerges from a conscious being, you would expect it to also look like a brain for the same reason. So we have 4 good arguments to support the first premise, and we know the universe is emergent. Therefore, it follows that the best explanation of reality is that the universe is emergent from a mind. So that's the first argument. Before I move to the second, any questions? I see AJ has got a question. He says, just because the mind is made up of some quantum matter, why doesn't the fact that the universe is made up of the same thing mean that it's a mind, made by a mind? Okay, so just because a mind is made up by some quantum matter, why does the fact that the universe is made up of the same thing mean that it's a mind? Well, it's a logical, it's a reasonable inference would be what I'm thinking of here. So the way you got to think of it is like, again, if minds are quantum in nature, the way you think, the way you operate is quantum, We know the universe is fundamentally quantum. It's just it just seems likely that what the universe emerged from is also a mind. If it didn't, it emerged from something very, very, very much like it while also not being a mind. That sounds ad hoc. Because if you can explain the universe saying, well, it looks like a mind, therefore it probably is a mind, it's ad hoc to come say, no, it may look like that, but it's not that. It's like showing up to a murder scene and going, well, no, I don't think he was murdered. I think it's suicide, even though there's clear evidence of a murder there. Well, you got to have evidence to explain why. If you're not going to offer any, then we are justified in going with this explanation that the universe emerged from a mind. Christina's got a hand up. If you want to unmute yourself, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question because like we were talking about like just the idea of like idealism and something I learned about in my philosophy class recently was because well I go to the Catholic university and so we learned about Descartes who
Mm.
we knew was a substance dualist and I'm curious about the differences between like substance dualism and idealism because I know that a lot of Christians are substance dualists, and a lot of them, I guess, are idealists as well. So it's like, where do you think, as an idealist, where do you think, like, if there are any like weaknesses in the substance dualist position?
Yeah, there. For one thing, it's overcomplicated. And I'll explain this a little bit more as I go through the second argument. But I mean, again, no, look at what you experience. So if I'm going here's what the argument I'm going to make. Actually, I'm gonna answer your argument as I go through this one. So why don't I just start going through that, and then I'll pause after that, and you can ask some more questions if you have any more. So
Yeah,
I will
awesome.
explain
Thank
it
you.
as I go through that. Yeah. So the second argument is a cosmic conscious argument. Okay. Premise one: contingent minds either have a personal explanation or a natural explanation, or I guess you could say a combination. Here are some examples, but all of them are going to fall basically into one of these two. Okay? Idealism is true, thus all is reducible to mind. So this is where I'm going to answer your question here. So how do we argue this? Okay? Well, the substance dualist again wants to say that matter is a substance and mind is a substance and they interact. Well, first I have to solve that. It's called the interaction problem. Idealists don't have to solve that. So right then and there, it's more parsimonious. It's simpler. So right then and there. But here's another argument. So take bundle theory. This is what I'm about to do with the cup here. Okay, so how would you describe this cup? It's purple. It's hard. It's clear. You can kind of see through it. Now, take away all the mental properties what is left? Bundle theory says that physical things are bundles of properties. So, give some another analogy. Take an apple. You can describe it as red, shiny, smooth, tasty. Remove all those. What is left? What substance is there at that point? I would say that there isn't there. Basically, the argument from idealists is that physical things are a collection of properties. There's no need to posit a physical substance we call matter when matter can be fully explained in terms of mental experiences, mental imagery, properties. So, for example, Susan Schneider says pure property ontologies need to take physical objects as metaphysically derivative, even objects that physics regards as fundamental. Objects are instead bundled out of properties, or they are properties. So again, think of everything in this image here. It's just mental sensations. Okay? If you took away the observer, would you have the feeling of wetness? If you took away the observer here, would you have the sensation or the taste of a raspberry? Okay, again, what is a taste? It's hitting your tongue, going up to your brain, making electrical signal. You could explain a computer could explain all of that without ever knowing what a raspberry tastes like. So taste seems to be something different. It's not just this electrical signals. Taste doesn't emerge from electrical signals in the brain. So Keith Ward, I cited him earlier. I'm back to this quote. Again, think of physical objects. They're just bundled out of various properties, various sensations, various qualia, colors, sounds, smells. Now, the physicalists might come back and say, well, what about particles? Well, we know particles exist without those sensations, but remember the earlier part of this presentation. Particles aren't there. That's just mathematics. That's all just information. So everything we know about the physical world is information, properties, sensations. It all seems to be mental experiences. If the physical at the base level reduces to information, and everything we experience is just mental information, qualia, why posit a physical substance? Everything is just mind and information. I'm not saying everything is just mind, but you'd say it's mind and it's information that it processes. So what is fundamental reality? Mind. So again, everything seems to just be qualia, feeling, shapes, and you describe all of this in terms of mental without any reference to a physical object. So any questions about that before I move on? Cool. Awesome. So, first conclusion is the natural universe cannot be the explanation of contingent minds, our consciousness. Okay, just to recap, contingent minds either have personal explanations or natural explanations. If idealism is true, okay, contingent minds are not going to reduce to natural explanations because natural things emerge from mind, or they're contingent on mind, or they're processed by minds. Okay, so if the natural universe cannot be the explanation of contingent minds, where do we go from here? The explanation of the existence of conscious minds is personal. So consciousness gives our consciousness, our individual instantiations of consciousness have an explanation of something that is personal. This personal source that where all contingent minds come from is what we call God, therefore God exists. Because if we come from a source of consciousness, that source would be conscious. It just logically follows. It wouldn't be non-sentient. That's just, I don't know how you get around that. So here's some philosophers. Bernardo Kastrup says the whole universe is a mind, but not your individual psyche alone, for mind extends far beyond the boundaries of personal introspection. Now he denies the existence of a personal God, and I'm baffled as to why. Like, how could you do that? It doesn't seem to logically follow. If you think everything is conscious, everything is contingent on mind, then what everything comes from would also be a mind. Keith Ward says the potentially mind-like reality or realities that are creatively and progressively expressed in the physical cosmos, and sees mind as the individuating agents of the unity and the cumulative development of different streams. Helen Yetter Chapel says external reality is a vast unity of consciousness, independent from all finite minds. Now that just all sounds like God. So it just seems that God exists. So I'm going to do another argument. It's called the moral argument, which is completely different than the two arguments I presented here. So any questions about anything I've covered thus far, now's the time.
Yes, I have a question. Regarding your inference to if fundamental reality emerges from a mind that explains our minds, or that if we have minds, that the things that explain it must be conscious. I believe can't a cause or can't something that or something's constituents have different properties than the whole? Can the parts have different properties than the whole? And if so, then why do we have to infer that our consciousness is explained by a personal mind?
Well, we're not bringing. I think the reply is we're not bringing parts into this. We're not saying we're a part of God. We're saying that if we are conscious minds and consciousness is irreducible, it's got to come from a source of consciousness, and that just logically follows that source would also be consciousness, and the basis of all consciousness. But if it's conscious, then it's also a mind as well. How could you have consciousness without a mind? And of course, if this source of consciousness is processing and giving rise to all of reality, it would have a vast amount of information that it processes, which is what we do. We're conscious agents that process information. They make us minds. Likewise, at the base of reality, the same thing. So I don't think we would use the language of parts here.
I guess also then in terms of causation, can't a cause have? I guess I'm just kind of confused as to why there needs to be that inference there.
Yeah, well, it goes to this. So if something causes our consciousness, I mean that means And it's not, and it's not conscious itself. That would mean our consciousness is reducible to smaller parts. And this
I
relates
see.
back to the hard problem of consciousness. You can't
Right.
reduce consciousness. You can't break it into parts.
Okay. Yeah, this would be David Chalmers' works if anyone wants to read about the hard problem of consciousness. But thank you for that.
Yeah. So let's move on to the moral argument. Now, people tend to not like the moral argument because of the way that it's been presented, which is generally that, like, for example, as William Lane Craig has presented it, is like, he said, like, if objective moral facts and duties exist, then God exists. Objective moral facts and duties exist, therefore God exists. People go, well, how do you get there? How do objective moral values and duties get you to God? Well, I'm going to present an argument today that's going to get you there. We're going to start with this. So, non-natural moral realism is true, which is just the idea that there are objective moral values and duties that are not reducible to natural substances or things. This is, by the way, if anyone's going to dispute you on this, on moral realism being true, the burden is on them. A lot of skeptics think the burden is always on you. When it comes to moral realism, the burden is on the person who rejects moral realism. Why? Because moral realism is intuitive. It's our intuitive starting point. You're going to reject that. Okay? You better meet the burden. No society has ever existed that has not had some sort of idea of objective moral values and duties, and justice is required if somebody violates them. Even if we disagree on what those objective moral values and duties exist, it just seems to be the intuitive starting point of humans that they exist. So Richard Boyd said, in the sciences, we decide between theories on the basis of observation, which have an important degree of objectivity. It appears that in moral reasoning, moral intuitions play the same role, which observations do in science. We test general principles in moral theories by seeing how their consequences conform or fail to conform to our moral intuitions about particular cases. So we start with our moral intuitions, and everyone agrees it's wrong to, for example, torture babies. It's wrong to grape. It's just wrong to do that type of stuff. So then we reason from there. So even if there's a society that comes along and says, well, I think it's okay to grape in certain instances, you'll never actually find a society that thinks everything is relative. They still are going to be operating by a certain code they think is objective. David Brink says, our moral reasoning and discourse might be systematically mistaken, but this would be a revisionary conclusion, to be accepted only as the result of extended and compelling argument that the commitments of ethical objectivity are unsustainable. In the meantime, we should treat the objectivity of ethics as a kind of default assumption or working hypothesis. So again, the moral realist has the intuitive starting point. If a skeptic comes along and they think that no, everything is relative, yada, 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 the burden is on them to show that, not us. So moral realism is true. Premise 2. So if objective moral values and duties exist, then they are personal in nature. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's think about some examples here. So let's think about moral obligations. You could call it moral prescriptions. Let's say I prescribe to you the duty to be my bodyguard. Okay, that's a prescription. It exists between two minds. Okay? Prescriptions, obligations, can only exist between two minds. They're not descriptions. You can't find them in nature. So therefore, if we have objective prescriptions that we have to follow, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, these kinds of things, it then implies that they come from some sort of objective necessary mind. Because again, prescriptions exist between minds. You don't find them in nature. Peter S. Williams says, I have moral obligations, but since I can't be obligated by anything non-personal, e.g. the evolutionary history of my species, I must be obligated by something personal. Since there are objective moral obligations that transcend all finite persons or groups thereof, there must therefore be a transcendent personal reality to whom we are most fundamentally obligated. Think of the moral ideal. If there is an objective moral ideal, you're going to picture an agent that always does the right things. You're not going to picture abstract laws divorced from an agent. So if there's an objective moral ideal, that would necessarily be an agent. So think of guilt or shame. Peter S. Williams says this. He says, since it would be inappropriate to feel guilt or shame before an abstract, impersonal moral principle, And since it is appropriate to feel guilt and shame before the objective moral law, the moral law cannot be an abstract moral principle. In other words, objective moral values must be ontologically grounded in a transcendent personality before whom it is appropriate to feel guilt. Since humans feel guilt when we violate the moral law, it doesn't make sense if there was no personal force behind that. Like, you can think of it even with laws today, like in like our court system. When we violate a law, there's a personal force behind it. If there are objective laws beyond any human construct, why would we feel guilt for violating them if there's no agent there? So, if objective moral values and duties are personal, then they're grounded in a personal source. This personal source is what we call God, that therefore God exists. So any questions about this? To recap, it's pretty simple. So if objective moral values and duties exist, okay, start from that. Don't start from God. God is the conclusion. So start from, okay, we agree there, if you get someone to agree there's objective moral values and duties, then ask, okay, well, what are they? Well, they're personal in nature. Think of obligations, prescriptions. Those exist between minds. Think of the moral ideal. The moral ideal exists would be an agent necessarily. If there's an objective ideal that humans are to obtain, we're picturing an agent. Think of guilt. Guilt requires an agent. Therefore, if there's some sort of objective, there are these objective moral values and duties for us to follow, they are necessarily personal in nature, and that's just what we call God. So any questions about that? Excellent. That means I explained it super well. So to summarize now, let's summarize some stuff here. So a lot of people that reject theism will still be like, okay, so what? Okay, what I can explain all of that in different. I could explain the emergent universe using gray mapping. I can explain consciousness with a different model. Like maybe I want to use property dualism or something. I can explain moral realism with a natural way. And you could get into the nitty gritty and show there's problems there. I definitely do that. But just think about this. Let's say they could all come up with the best explanations ever for each of these. Okay? They're still violating Occam's razor. Just think about it. Think about this in terms of what we're saying here. I can explain the emergent nature of the universe. I can explain consciousness. I can explain moral realism with one explanation. God exists. The atheist has to say, well, I have to come up with something else for the emergent universe. I have to come up with somehow the physical processes give rise to consciousness. I have to come up with another explanation for moral realism. Notice they have to come up with different explanations for each of these. Okay, that their worldview is more complicated. We can explain more of reality with less. And I think that just suggests that means theism is more likely to be true. If all things are pointing to God in different areas of research, better explanation of reality is theism. And by the way, let's think of all sorts of other arguments we could add. Arguments from fine-tuning, argument from reason, the ontological argument, the explanation of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Okay? The atheist, again, has to come up with all different explanations for these things, which is where we have one explanation. God exists. So because of that, what is the best explanation of reality? God exists. And that just, if multiple areas of reality can all be explained by God, I think that's just the designer pointing out that, hey, I'm everywhere. You can't get away from me because this is just the way reality is. If you come up with, and either way, it's still a violation of parsimony, violation of Occam's razor. Sometimes when I talk to atheists, I like to do this. I'm like, I can explain the universe with God. And the atheist will be like, well, I can explain it with this. Okay, well, I can explain consciousness with God as well. I'm like, well, I can explain consciousness through this model of brain processes. Okay, well, I can explain moral realism with God. Well, I can explain it with natural processes. Different ones, of course. Notice what they're doing. They're coming up with all sorts of different explanations to account for reality. That's ad hoc. We have a much more coherent worldview where we can explain all of reality with one explanation. That there was an absolute perfect being that gave rise to all these things. Therefore, God exists. That's the end of the presentation, and I can take questions from here.
Could you explain the principle of parsimony and what Occam's razor actually is? Because I think people might be confused. They just say, "Oh, it's just a simpler idea." So
Yeah.
is that what it is? But
Yeah, no,
could you, yeah,
Occam's razor is you do not multiply entities beyond necessity. The key word is the key phrase is beyond necessity. So to give an analogy, let's say we come across a crime scene. And I go, well, it looks like there's a stab wound by the neck. The knife is on the table. It's covered in blood. The simplest explanation is somebody stabbed this victim. And you go, no, I think aliens shot him with a laser and put the knife in there to frame someone. Okay, you just complicated the crime scene. Now we have to posit aliens. We have to posit them visiting Earth and have a reason to kill this guy. It's simpler to posit just a human stabbed him. So Occam's razor says you go with the simplest explanation that can account for all the data, not just the simplest explanation. Because sometimes the simplest explanation doesn't account for all the data. Thales, the ancient Greek philosopher, just said everything was just water. That's simple, but doesn't really account for everything we know about reality. So we don't go with what Thales said, even though it was simple. So we go with quantum mechanics because it's the simplest explanation that can account for all the data. So that's what Occam's razor is like. Occam's razor is you posit the simplest explanation that can account for all the data, and as you can see, that's God.
Anyone have any other questions?
Last?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sure you get this like objection many times. I think it's just as ridiculous. But how exactly would you respond to atheists or skeptics whenever they just try to explain it all away by just crying out "God of the gaps"?
My what I like to do with them is I go, okay, well, what's your and so what they will never really just say that. They'll always follow it up with, well, this is a God of the gaps, and people used to think thunder was caused by gods, and we figured out that, and then in the future, scientists are going to figure out all this stuff, and we won't need God anymore. And I just go, well, you know what you're doing? That's called a future humans of the gaps. You're just positing future humans are going to solve all this stuff for you, and you're filling the gap in with them. And that's not what we're doing. Again, we're saying the best explanation of this data is the inference of theism.
Thank you.
There's a comment in the chat. How would you specifically counter the argument that the objective moral obligations come from the benefits of civilization, societal Darwinism, but don't have intrinsic value? Simply put, that's just not the way objective moral values and duties map onto reality. I mean, the benefit of a civilization would be to dominate all other civilizations, but we think it's morally wrong to do that. I mean, what would be wrong with what the Nazis were doing then? They're just doing what's the beneficial for their civilization, taking out what they appear to be weakness. We think that's wrong. So the way moral values and duties map onto reality doesn't match, it doesn't align with societal benefits or societal Darwinism. There's many ways they don't.
What are your thoughts on I haven't looked into this, but it might be something interesting you could talk on. What are your thoughts on Eric Wielenberg's account of moral realism under naturalism? I don't know if you've done any work in that.
I did a video a while back called A Critique of Non-Natural, or a critique of natural moral realism. I don't know his specific case, but I use things like the open question argument and the Izzat problem, among other things. The difference between categorical imperatives and hypothetical imperatives. But I don't know his specific formula.
Anyone, either raise your hand or just unmute and feel free to ask a question. Let's see if we got anything in the chat.
No, I got them all.
If we don't have any... sorry, go ahead.
I actually really do enjoy a lot of your like argument from like cosmic consciousness and like the emergent universe arguments. I just really wish that like more apologists like yourselves would also be using them, because I really think that they're like a really killer. Like, why do you think that more like apologists don't typically like use them?
Because you've not started a channel yet and started making them.
Fair enough.
That's what I think that if you don't think there's enough apologists out there doing it, you get out and do it and start small and try to build yourself up. I want everyone to do that if you feel like that needs to be done. I think the reason why people don't do it is because, again, these are kind of new stuff, and people are they're worried they have to research way too much about this before they get involved in it. But also, I think as societally speaking, we've kind of moved past the whole new atheist movement, and very few people are asking the question, "Does God exist now?" I mean, I'm not getting that question as much as I was 10 years ago. Now people are like, okay, yeah, we know God exists, but why is Christianity true? Is now the question people are asking me. So I focused
Or
on a lot of my research on that.
at least for the ones that are like, I don't know, the ones that stay atheists, I feel like a lot of them are very mad at God still because they don't align to what they think should be what God does, you know.
Yeah,
But that's
and
more of a heart problem.
that's another thing is that when I deal with them, they're not even like arguing against these arguments. Now they're just being like, well, problem of evil, problem of suffering. That's why I don't believe
Yeah,
God exists.
yeah, they're like, I don't like God. You know, it's like, well, but that's not a good reason. I mean, sure, you can object to God being good, but like submit to God still because
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't matter if you agree. I mean, you should align your will with his, you know, pray and whatnot, um, to align your will and to understand, you know, because the
Mm-hmm.
human heart is bent towards evil and we justify our evil. And that's kind of where scripture is so useful too, because scripture is a sword and it cuts to the soul. Like I was not saved because of good arguments. You know, at the heart of it, it is definitely scripture that we need to remember too.
Yeah.
You know,
We got
repent and
Yeah.
believe.
we got some more questions in the chat from Luca. Hopefully, I'm saying that right. About the moral argument, would you have any particular argument against alternatives for the source of moral prescriptions, like let's say Platonic universals?
Yeah. So I would just say that doesn't make sense because that doesn't account for them. As I said, these are personal in nature. So if these Platonic universals exist, that suggests they are also personal. Uh, so like, why are the Platonic universals give us moral prescriptions, but they themselves are not personal in nature? That is, I think that just makes it ad hoc.
What would be another question? What would be your response to the statement, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence as it relates to evidence for God, miracles, etc.?
Yeah, extraordinary is such a subjective term. It means what anybody ever wants. So I just say, well, you're in luck. All my evidence is extraordinary. And then what are you going to say? Like, I get you said I have extraordinary claim. Well, luckily, I've also labeled all my evidence as extraordinary. Therefore, it meets your. So unless you're going to give me a rigorous definition of an extraordinary, I'm going to say all my evidence is extraordinary.
What sources would you point to in order to learn more about emergence, idealism, and consciousness in your first argument? We're gonna have for on this. We're probably gonna have Joshua Rasmussen
There you go.
back,
Go to him. Perfect. Yeah, go
and
to his books.
and I had an interview with him, but hopefully we can get him back to do a lecture on
Yeah.
philosophy of mind. But yeah, what would you say?
Yeah, Josh Rasmussen is perfect. Check out his stuff. Check out the book Idealism: New Essays in Metaphysics. Yeah, check out that kind of stuff as well. Bernardo Kastrup has got some really good work for arguing for idealism.
Wait, AJ, are you from Stanford? If you are, the Stanford Encyclopedia is a good place to start.
Yep.
Outside the Bible, how would we prove that God is good or the source of goodness, probably relating to the moral argument?
Uh, Using the moral argument I used today, you can't prove that's the Christian God from the moral argument. You can prove that there is a God that exists and he is morally perfect. And then it logically follows that if God is morally perfect, he would care about creatures in some way. So he'd want to present himself to us, to guide us. Then it just becomes a question of which religion is most likely to match moral goodness. And that would most likely be Christianity.
And
So that's
another
what I would say.
thing, and another thing that C.S. Lewis points out is that, and this goes back to, you know, the universal consciousness where we all kind of agree on a lot of fundamentals about what is moral. Um, that kind of hints at the one who created us is moral, you know, intrinsically moral, because if a God created us and we have a shared conscience to do good, and we know we have to do good, then surely that God also knows what is good and has created it. Or is it? Maybe
Sorry,
not a
say that
perfect
again. I
explanation.
was breaking up a little bit. Say that again.
I think I muddled it up too. So essentially, because we have conscience, where and I mean consciences, like, moral consciences. And this goes back to your point about how, civilizations across history have shared a lot of moral values. You would think that the one that created us would likely share those same values because I think everyone has a good sense that we are modeled after the creator
Yeah.
and we
Yeah.
are very like the creator.
Yeah,
We're,
that would
we're
be likely. If God is morally perfect and morally good, that would logically follow as well too.
Yeah,
yeah,
this could tie
if
into some ontological argument that the necessary grounding for existence has to have these great making properties. Um, and moving on to another question. Any other advice for early YouTube channels? I've had my content covered by Paulogia, Mr. Deity, Justin DZ, and many others. I don't know who these are besides Paulogia. And I feel like the internet space is just really dominated by a huge amount of atheist keyboard warriors.
That's weird because I'm actually finding the opposite now. They're probably just picking on you because you're a smaller creator. They tend to do that, and they're trying to they're going to go after that kind of stuff. So I wouldn't be super discouraged because I'm seeing the exact opposite. Just fight them back. I mean, don't let them push you around. If they think they can push you around, they're going to keep doing it. So just respond to them, debunk their stuff, and then they're going to realize that you're too much of a hassle, and they're going to move on to someone else they think they can pick on.
is this true?
So yeah, I'm not seeing a lot of that anymore. So it seems like it's gone down in my experience.
It's Tavo, Michael. Follow up to
Yeah,
that is
I know
your
you.
yeah, we've chatted just a couple of times.
Yeah.
Follow up to that is your debate with Richard Carrier was really fantastic, and it was a nice opportunity to see these arguments stress tested in an actual argumentation scenario. And your performance was fantastic, by the way. So that's
Thank you.
just a good resource for people as well if they want to see these
Oh yeah,
arguments stress tested.
that was fun because
Yeah.
he remember the universe was created by a dot with one property. No, it's actually a bubble with two properties, but it's not God. It's like,
Yeah, yeah.
it's the weirdest thing ever.
So
Magical
it's a
bubble.
computer. Yeah, I remember hearing that question asked to William Lane Craig. I'm surprised it's still even around. Um, what are your thoughts on Joshua Rasmussen's argument from a perfect foundation and the argument from arbitrary limits? It seems that the way you frame your cumulative case would dovetail rather nicely with his work.
Yeah, a lot of stuff that I did on perfect being theism was based on his work. So yeah, we're very that when I was talking about that's coming from a lot of his stuff.
All right, we have a last call for any other questions. We'll let Mr. Jones get off the call and get to his other obligations, but this is your last chance for to ask someone who's been in this space for a very long time. All right. Well, it seems that no one else has any further questions. So I'll let Michael Jones get going. And thank you all for coming. And thank you, Michael Jones, for all the work that you've done and for presenting for us today.
All right, yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I'll see you guys next time.
Hopefully so.
Thank you.